Imagine spending your entire life building something magnificent and then watching someone else put their name on it. Not a theft you could contest, not a forgery you could expose. Something slower than that, something more patient, something that worked by simply never acknowledging you existed in the first place. That is what happened to Ukrainian painters at the height of the Russian Empire. The work survived. The canvases are still hanging in Saint Petersburg. The brushwork still breathes with intelligence and feeling. But the names, the cities of birth, the languages spoken in childhood, the iconographic traditions that shaped every compositional choice, those were quietly, methodically erased. This is the story of what was taken, of two men who gave it away without quite being able to, and of the one man who, when his turn came, refused. To understand what was lost, you first need to understand what existed. Ukraine had been a land of extraordinary artistic vitality. The Orthodox Church had developed a tradition of icon painting that was not merely religious, it was psychological. The faces in those icons weren't otherworldly abstractions. They looked back at you. They carried memory. They carried loss. And then everything changed. Catherine the Great dissolved the Hetmanate, the semi-autonomous Cossack state that had been the spine of Ukrainian political life, in 1764. It wasn't a war. It was an administrative decision, a stroke of the imperial pen. And with it, the structures that had sustained a Ukrainian cultural leadership simply ceased to exist. The nobility that might have commissioned Ukrainian art was absorbed into Russian aristocratic life. The clergy that might have supported Ukrainian artistic schools was increasingly Russified. The language of cultural ambition, the language of careers, of patronage, of advancement, shifted decisively to Russian. But here is what no one talks about. The erasure didn't come through destruction, it came through invitation. In 1757, Saint Petersburg opened an Academy of Arts, and it was extraordinary, world-class, offering training in the classical tradition that was then reshaping European painting. The grand manner, the historical canvas, the portrait as a philosophical statement about power and personhood. For a young painter in Kiev or Poltava, the Academy was not a cage. It was a door. The only door that seemed to lead anywhere. And so they went. One by one, the most gifted painters Ukrainian soil had produced in a generation made the journey north. To Saint Petersburg, to the academy, to careers that would make them celebrated under a flag that was not their own. Among them, a young man from Kiev named Dmytro Levytsky, and a painter of icons from the town of Mirhorod named Volodymyr Borovykovsky. To St. Petersburg, to the academy, to careers that would make them famous under a flag that was not their own. Shevchenko would go on to introduce the historical painting style to the entire Russian Empire. He founded the School of History Painting at the Academy itself. The tradition he built from nothing at the edge of the imperial project is still considered the origin point of Russian academic art. But Shevchenko was from Lviv. That is a city in Ukraine. Of all the painters who made that journey north, none achieved what Dmytro Levytsky achieved. Born in Kyiv in 1735, the son of a priest engraver who had trained in the Ukrainian iconographic tradition, Levytsky arrived in Saint Petersburg as a young man and within 2 decades had become the most celebrated portrait painter in the empire. Not among Ukrainians, not among provincial painters. The most celebrated portrait painter in the entire Russian Empire. He painted Catherine the Great. He painted the aristocracy. He painted the intellectual luminaries of the Russian Enlightenment. His canvases hung in the Winter Palace. His students shaped Russian portraiture for a generation. His work is magnificent, technically audacious, psychologically penetrating, emotionally precise in a way that few European painters of the period could match. And when you look at it now, knowing where he came from, you begin to notice something. What historians rarely mention is that the way Levytsky structured a face, the weight he placed on the eyes, the stillness he preserved even in the most lavishly costumed subjects, carries the echo of a very specific tradition. Not the French academic tradition, not the Dutch or Flemish influence that shaped so many of his contemporaries. Something older, something rooted in the formal language of Ukrainian iconography. The icon tradition had taught painters that a face was not merely a surface to render, it was a threshold. A place where the interior life of a person became visible to another human being. Levytsky never forgot that lesson. He simply translated it into the language of oil on canvas, of Enlightenment portraiture, of courtly commission. The icons of his childhood became the psychological intelligence of the greatest portraits of the Russian court. Nobody called it Ukrainian. Nobody was supposed to. His most celebrated student was Volodymyr Borovykovsky. Born in the town of Mirhorod in central Ukraine in 1757. Borovykovsky spent his early career painting icons for Ukrainian churches. The tradition he knew, the tradition he trusted. And then Catherine the Great passed through his town. He painted allegorical panels for her visit. She noticed. He was summoned north. And this is where the painting stops being about art. Borovykovsky went on to paint approximately 160 portraits. He introduced sentimentalism to Russian portraiture, a new emotional register, warmer, more intimate, more attuned to interiority. His paintings of women in particular, the famous Lopukina portrait, the soft-eyed subjects caught in moments of private reverie, changed the emotional vocabulary of Russian art. But in his later work, something else appeared. Something quiet. Something that didn't look like the imperial court. He returned to icons, Ukrainian icons, painted in the old manner, in the old formal language. Not commissions, not public works. Private devotion. As if the years of building Russian culture with his hands had left a part of him unreachable. Still kneeling in front of the same images he had known as a boy in Mirhorod. The question that raises, what happens to the thing you cannot give away, is the question this story has been circling all along. There is a word in Ukrainian, rozryv, that means rupture. A tearing, not a break, but a wound that stays open. What these painters lived was a rozryv of identity. They produced at the highest level a culture that absorbed their labor without acknowledging their origins. Their talent was welcome. Their Ukrainianness was not. For decades, historians trained inside the Russian imperial and later Soviet tradition simply didn't ask the question. The Academy produced Russian art. The Academy's painters were Russian painters. The biographical footnote, born in Kyiv, born in Lviv, born in Mirhorod, was precisely that. A footnote. The answer was hidden in plain sight, and it changes everything. Because what those footnotes reveal is not an exception to the history of Russian art. They reveal a structural dependency. The foundational generation of Russian academic painting was largely Ukrainian. The techniques, the emotional intelligence, the formal traditions they carried from their training in icon workshops. These were not absorbed and then discarded. They were foundational. Russian art at its origin was built on Ukrainian hands. And then came Taras Shevchenko. Shevchenko is known above all as a poet, the bard of Ukraine. The man whose words became the emotional core of a national identity that the empire had spent a century trying to dissolve. But Shevchenko was also, by profession, a painter. A formally trained artist who had studied at the Saint Petersburg Academy, the same institution that had absorbed Levytsky and Borovykovsky a generation before. He could have done what they did. He was talented enough. He chose differently. Shevchenko turned his gaze back, He painted Ukraine, its landscapes, its architectural monuments, its people. He painted the serfs, the poor, the ordinary faces that imperial portraiture had no use for. And when the Tsar exiled him to Central Asia for his political writings, he painted what he found there too: the Kazakh steppe, the customs of people the empire was in the process of subjugating, documenting, bearing witness, refusing the comfortable amnesia that had swallowed his predecessors. He was explicitly forbidden during his exile from writing or drawing. He did both in secret. For centuries, everyone looked at this history and missed what was really there. The story wasn't about artists who left Ukraine. It was about what Ukraine put into them before they left, and whether it could survive the crossing. In Levytsky and Borovykovsky, something survived. You can see it if you know where to look, in the quality of attention, in the weight behind the eyes of their subjects, in the devotional icons Borovykovsky returned to when no one was commissioning anything. In Shevchenko, it didn't merely survive, it detonated. There is a self-portrait Shevchenko made sometime in the 1840s. He is looking directly at you. Not with the composed dignity of a Levytsky sitter, not with the tender introspection of a Borovykovsky subject, with something older than either of those things. Something that has seen what happens when a culture decides that certain names don't need to be remembered. Something that has weighed the cost of the Academy, of the Commission, of the invitation north, and chosen instead the harder direction. The paintings of Levytsky and Borovykovsky still hang in Saint Petersburg. Magnificent, undeniable, attributed for most of their existence to the flowering of Russian genius. The names of the cities where those men were born are in the footnotes. But footnotes, it turns out, are not the same as silence. And a self-portrait is not the same as a disappearance.